Hi friends, host Eric here, host Talking with Famous People, and I am here today to respond to some comments and basically to clarify a little bit why I'm right and Socionics and MBTI are wrong to the extent to which they disagree with me. I make this assertion, I've made it many times. One of the biggest problems I tend to run across as far as people disagreeing with me is people really don't like it when I tell them that TI is objective, not a subjective logic, that FE is objective, not subjective, that TE is subjective, not objective, and that FI is subjective. Additionally, people sometimes object to it when I tell them that NI is objective. Megabro insists his NI is subjective. Remember, only you can pay attention, okay? There is no manner of human attention that does not source from the subject. So if you want to say you have an intentional manner that is entirely unconnected to you as a human being, well, that's obviously silly. Nobody's making that claim. It seems to be something that my opponents sometimes forget on this point, right? Obviously, every manner of attention exists only insofar as it is a manifestation of an individual human being existing. It doesn't exist outside of a human being expressing it. So if you want to say everything's subjective because it comes from a human being, then you're not saying anything, because the word subjective then loses all meaning. What do we mean by subjective and objective is really the core question that comes up here in my exchange with Sarah Collins. Now, Sarah Collins is a commenter who put an interesting comment and evoked from me a fairly long back and forth with the typing, typing with my fingers, which I don't normally like to have comment exchanges like this. But I'm going to read it and we'll comment on it. I think you're wrong about FE, she says. FE seems to me to be more about identifying and recognizing the relationships and patterns of human interaction, says the FENI user. Okay. There is no judgment in doing so. It then becomes the job of the next function in the stack to make a judgment about what to do about such relationships and patterns. Okay, well, I said this is an excellent, interesting comment. I sort of agree with you. Foremost, though, it's not the job of the next function in the stack. Instead, it will always be the job of TI, which is the judging function that's paired with FE. FE, contrary to almost all primary interpretations of the Jungian model, is not a judging function. Instead, FE is an interface function like TE. It's not true, however, that FE concerns don't comprise a value against which stuff is adjudicated. We know, for example, that extroverted feelers prefer harmony over efficiency when the two conflict. The valuing of FE concerns is implicit and assumed by the FE user. In other words, an FE user doesn't actively involve the criterion through which FE interface occurs, because while one might craft the perceptions of others according to an internal standard of how one would like to be perceived, the FE process doesn't actually consciously address the question of how one would like to be perceived. It merely moves to the goal of being perceived more like one would like to be perceived. Or it interfaces according to that overarching consideration. Therefore, FE never evaluates its own value criterion, but rather it nevertheless correlates strongly with certain values that drive how the XXFJ's TI defines fairness and consistency. It is this FE-shaped TI that the XXFJ then uses to render judgment. So Sarah provided a thorough response to this, which I appreciated. In other words, what you are saying is FE is a subjective classification. No, that's not what I'm saying. A subjective classification system. The FE user is unconsciously using a set of criteria to classify the types of interactions they are witnessing. They are recognizing and naming in the same way a scientist would establish a classification system. But there is no judgment from a decision-making standpoint. However, each system is based on the FE user's own criteria. There are lots of ways to classify the same thing, and it's all relative to a person's particular perspective and orientation. The next function in the stack, TI for an INFJ, would then make decisions on how to move forward based on what was observed and classified names based on the organization of the unconscious FE classification system. This is the function that makes the decision as to whether something is logical or illogical for TI. Totally agree. FE and TI are not judging functions. They're best called classifying functions, she says. But NI and SI are judging functions. NI seeks the most probable cause as a basis for conscious decision making. NI and SI are not judging functions at all. But I will explain in my response. But I'm just reading her response right now. NI seeks the most probable cause or independent variable as a basis of conscious decision making. Hence, it is conscious, but it's not that way. Is what I need to stop responding right now and just read it. Or whether they wish to have those effects repeated. Hence, its backward-looking aspect. SI seeks the most or least desired effect or dependent variable and makes decisions based on whether they wish to have those effects repeated. Hence, it's backward-looking. NE and SE are like TE and FE, and they operate in the same way, but they classify and name causes and effects, not features of human interactions, FE, or object systems, TE. That's a cool notion. I love what you're doing here with your ideation, but you're barking up the wrong tree. There's a well-renowned cognitive scientist, Alison Gopnik, who has a mountain of accumulated evidence that even from a very young age we learn using scientific principles of observation, prediction, identification of cause and effect, and classification to learn about and engage in the world. I highly recommend her work, and I think there's a lot of top for MBTI. Okay, so then I explained to her that while I very much enjoyed her comment, it is wrong. No. NI and SI are epistemologies. Again, they link to implicit valuing frameworks, as do all manners of attention. Because the way in which you do something is going to have a shaping influence on your valuing process or legitimizing process, or just your preferred stuff too, just your personal preferences too. All right, this comment I wrote here explains how I think one ought to think about this, and the reason I think this is the best way to do it is because it withstands the most scrutiny, it has the fewest unnecessary variables, and it's the strongest case that I've ever heard made in terms of presenting how the system works. In other words, it withstands the most scrutiny. Nobody can tell me why it's wrong yet. Nobody's ever been able to come in here and prove to me, not prove even, and never been able to come in here and win an argument saying this other approach is better. Their other approach always loses to my approach when it's paired up against it. So this approach is the best until it gets beat. Hasn't been beat yet. It beats everything else so far. As NI and SI are epistemologies. They don't seek, they know. NI and SI provide that which needs to be decided. Well, I don't know what I meant there, but they provide the field upon which that which needs to be decided is decided. NI provides answers, as does SI. NI delivers a single correct truth, perceived by the NI user to be objective truth independent of their experience gleaned from the world. SI delivers the relevant data from personal experience, perceived by the SI user as knowledge. NI users direct as little scrutiny or consideration to their knowledge as SI users do to their memory. I, for example, don't recall taking a walk earlier and question the accuracy of my memory, even though I know it's fallible. The key is that both attentional manners are epistemological because they are interfaces with unconditional knowledge, as opposed to conclusions, for example, or real-time experiences. That doesn't mean that NI and SI don't shape judgment. Of course, one uses one's knowledge base in judging. Knowledge is the field, matters in dispute are the objects, judging is the function. Additionally, it is, of course, the case that one favors legitimizations that are complementary to the nature of their epistemology, and that colors the expression of their singular conscious judging function, TI or FI. We only have one that we use as our conscious, comfortable judging function. We either judge according to disinterested or interested considerations. FE and TE are not best called classifying functions. They are best called interface functions. They comprise three distinct modalities of interface: put, get, and receive. The classification distinction you draw is probably simply the metaphysical-physical distinction. The four objective or abstract functions are NE, NI, TI, and FE. Each of these functions deals in the approximate representations of human experience that we use to communicate our experiences to others, even though others cannot watch the movie of our real-time experience. Even if they could, they'd have to trade in that much duration of their life to experience that much duration of someone else's life. Language allows us to convey experiences that don't require you to undergo the experience. Namely, each deals in words, conditionals, language, arguments, and other time-static attentional matters. The reason we call them objective, these four functions, is that they deal only in the communicable aspects of objects. Objects are distinct, defined things that change only in a turn-based way and remain static until acted upon. Incommunicable aspects of subjects are subjective because they validate against information only accessible to the subject. To whom is the information accessible? That is the core question. If I say Joe's mad, I might be right or wrong. But if I tell you Joe's mad, you will say, how do you know? And I'll say, well, Joe said this, or gave me this facial expression, or something else. Contrast that with, I'm mad. I'm mad. Well, how do you know? Nobody would ever ask me that question. It's assumed that I know my own emotional state. It's assumed that I might be right about someone else's emotional state. And, of course, that's the case. I'm not necessarily right about someone else's emotional state. I could be wrong about it. And it's an objective status that we can all look at and draw conclusions about. So that's why FE is objective. Not because it's more logical or better or something. That's what people seem to think objective means. I don't know why. The reason it's objective is because it deals in objects. And the information it deals in is available and visible to other people. It's outside of the subject who's working with that information. Well, then, what about TI, Eric? How is TI objective then? Because that information is not available to others. Yes, it is. In other words, if I assert something, if I make a claim, if I make a statement, and give a reason for it, regardless of whether that reason is good, bad, or anything else, I have invited a TI critique, because now my stated reason is a rendering in objective form my subjective inclination. Now my subjective inclination is no longer unknowable. Even if it is unknowable in its true essence, it now exists in a knowable form called words. That knowable form called words means it's been rendered objective. And once it's objective, then TI can deal with it. So everything we talk about, we're talking about an objective process when we talk. We're talking about this approximation links to this approximation and generates this other approximation, and we draw whatever conclusions we want, but the point is it gets validated by the fact that it's transparently critiquable by others. Alright, so now that we've explained that a bit, the reason I read that paragraph, FE is objective despite the unconscious subjective field implied by, though not attended to by, the actual expression of the interface function. It can only deal, after all, in approximations of other people's feelings. It can't access the actual feelings of others directly. So, also, the criterion against which it implicitly checks is not individuated. It's a simple and universal criterion. I want to be liked and respected. Perceived to be both warm and competent is another way to put that. All FE users pursue this same simple goal. So, in other words, the goal itself isn't even subjective. It's a universal unconsciously dealt with goal by FE users. The individual, of course, will vary in that which he'd like to be perceived as competent at, and how he or she reads FE data will vary according to epistemological function, among other things. But the criterion itself is universal, not particularist, and that's the distinction that matters. In this regard, all the objective functions are classification functions, insofar as they deal with objects that gain their distinction from non-objects by way of their finite and defined boundaries, the distinguishing of which makes up functionally the same thing as classification, grouping, tagging, compacting the terms, etc. Any, then, is metaphysical action, the making of new meanings. That doesn't make it a classification system, it just means that it deals in objects that are subject to classification. NI is the metaphysical knowledge function, truth that is discovered. Again, it doesn't make it a classification system, it means it deals fundamentally in things that can and necessarily therefore are classified. TI is metaphysical judgment, legitimization according to that which is universalizable and disinterested. And FE is metaphysical agency interface, the approximation of how other agents are subjectively motivated. So all of these functions then are objective, they're all metaphysical, and they all deal then exclusively in meanings, which means necessarily that they're dealing in stuff that is classified and thus can be said to interact in some regard with classification. But none of them are classification functions per se. SI is as close as NI is as close as you get to a classification function for the metaphysical end of things, insofar as it organizes things, but yada yada yada. Eric is only telling the convenient part. I get criticized so much around here, I tell you. People don't like videos like this usually, where I'm telling it like it is, and I'm saying no, the conventional wisdom's wrong and I'm right. Eric, this one guy who made up this shit over here that I'm telling you about, my made up stuff is more right than everybody else's made up stuff. People fucking hate that. It's like the worst FE thing I could possibly do. But I can't help it if it's true. And it is true. So, I have no choice but to continue to hammer why it's true and wait for somebody to actually respond convincingly in some fashion that suggests to me that I've got it wrong. Remember, this isn't my first attempt at it. I have gotten it wrong in the past. And I've adjusted and adjusted and adjusted. And at this point, I haven't adjusted in a long time. Why? Because I got it right. Is it the only possible right interpretation of it? Yeah, basically. Could you use different words somewhat and basically say the same thing? Yeah, you could do that. But to the extent that it's distinct from existing models, is it right and they are wrong? Yes. To the extent that different existing models differ from this, are they wrong because they differ from this? Yes. Why would that be the case? Because this is right and this is wrong. Why? Well, Eric, but you're just saying it's right. You're not telling us why it's right. Well, all this explanation explains why it's right. It's because it's more consistent with our actual experience of things, and most importantly, it allows us to definitionally constrain the terms in such a way that they actually comprise the totality of human experience, and they actually can work mechanically using those definitions. And that's the problem that Model G's got, and that's the problem that every other thing has, is they don't distinguish. First of all, they don't make the fundamental classification that there are action, knowledge, judgment, and epistemological function. They don't make the distinction between each function is either the metaphysical or the physical expression of the same basic thing. And to the extent that they don't, then they're failing to get it right. They, for example, say ridiculous things like TI is subjective logic. It's not subjective at all. Of course it's not. We know for sure that it's not subjective. How? Because I could pass out the following argument to 10,000 reasonably smart people, and they'd all agree that it's not a valid argument. If I were to say, all pigs breathe, I breathe, therefore I'm a pig, the reason why we can't afford any credence to that reasoning is not because the conclusion is false. If we were worried about truth and falseness with TI, then it would definitely be subjective. Fortunately, TI is not concerned with truth and falseness. It's concerned with validity. Now, that argument is invalid. All humans breathe. I breathe, therefore I'm a human, is also invalid. Because the first one has untrue statements and the second one has true statements. It doesn't matter. That's how we know TI is universal. Because the validity of a given argument or position or statement is determined by the grammatical structure of the reasoning, not by the meaning of the words. And that's how we know TI is definitely objective. There's no disputing that fact, okay? There's no disputing the fact that if I give you a conditional logic test and ask you to tell me whether these following arguments are valid or invalid, if A, then B, and C or D, and if not D, then A, and not C, therefore B. Is that valid? Yeah, it is, actually. Maybe it's invalid? No, it's valid, period. That's it. There's no other answer, you see? It's objective in the same way that a math problem objectively has a right answer, except it's more objective than math because it doesn't matter I mean, it does because I guess it's the same objectivity as math by and large. Same objectivity in the sense that it's just that the conditional logic is necessarily implied by the nature of language. The fact that we use statement connectives and, or, if then, that we have conditionality as a manner of expression at all. Whereas math, it requires a level of constructedness to represent things directly like that. In other words, conditional logic is implicit to our ability to conceptualize it all. And of course it's universal. It's the one shared manner of attention that we can all use to determine rightness and wrongness by saying you've got to be consistent and you've got to be valid. Your invalid arguments don't mean you're wrong. They mean we shouldn't take you seriously. Okay, so yes, I am right. Everybody else is wrong. Now let's go over to the next thing I wanted to do here, which is this one. Amin Vasefi says ISFJ's ideal matches INFP, ISTP, ESFP, ENTP. And I reply, your assertion here is wrong. Only one of those is an even decent match. ISTP is a nightmare for ISFJ despite the FE because their SE makes their TI non-deliberative. They use it as a weapon to beat up ISFJ. And INFP and ESFP both have FI high in the stack, leading to inevitable conflict with the FE tool using ISFJ. And Amin Vasefi says, my assertion is accurate. Take an empirical approach. Observe couples in stable relationships and you'll find out. In fact, how many stable couples do I have to observe before I can empirically conclude, in fact, that ISTPs are better matches than ENTPs, or INFPs are better matches than ENFPs, or ESFP? How many relationships do I need to observe before I can empirically establish that? Huh? How many have you observed? So then he explains why he's wrong here. He says ENTP has TI and TE, where ISFJ has FE and FI. No, ENTP has TI tool and TE countervalued. Of course it has to be countervalued because while TI and TE don't necessarily conflict, they legitimize according to conflicting criteria. And that's obviously necessarily the case because if you approach every default situation as your tool function as TI, then you're choosing to adjudicate on universalizable and disinterested considerations, whereas to use TE requires you to